Thank you for coming tonight. And thank you to Mr. Stratton for setting us up in here. I was seeing a lot of, we were getting a lot of feedback on Facebook after we posted this, and I wasn't sure how big this would be. I was afraid we were going to outgrow our space next door. So thank you for accommodating us and finding us. So I am Cheryl Nero. For those of you who don't know me, I run the Lakeview site of Climate Community College, just right next door behind us. And I'm really, really excited to have this forum. And I'm glad you all came. This is going to be the first in a series of promoting community growth. And we've got these three excellent speakers this evening who are going to share their wisdom with us. And so, as you know, tonight's focus is diversity and inclusion. And we're going to hear about three different perspectives of the topic. So our three speakers here is Jane Lincoln. Jane is a counselor and licensed clinical social worker, lives here in Lakeview, works at the hospital. She's going to speak to us about the social, emotional aspects of diversity, racism. Jessica Bogardus, the executive director of the Lake County Chamber of Commerce. Jessica is going to speak this evening about the economic impact to communities, especially small rural communities like this. And then lastly, we have Monique Inero. Monique flew in from Anchorage, Alaska for us last night, and you might recognize the last name. So Monique lives in Anchorage, but she has strong ties to the community. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, parents, siblings. So she's well represented in these communities. And we wanted to, I really wanted it to be, this first panel really have our community members, because it is about all of us sharing this community and promoting community growth. That said, we will start with Ms. Bogardus. And we'll let everybody speak, and then after, when they're done, if anybody has some comments or questions, we're happy to take those at the end.
Thank you, Cheryl. So, hi, thank you guys all for coming and for finding our new location. I want to thank Cheryl for including me and KCC in this discussion. I'm really passionate about this part of my work. It's really exciting to see the conversations that are starting around this subject. Through the chamber, we have kind of two main jobs, and the first part is business to business. So we do a lot of business to business work and promotions through that way. And we also have tourism on the other side. So I'm going to talk to you kind of mainly about both ends of those spectrum and how inclusion and diversity affect our business-to-business relationships and business to consumer, and also through our tourism and visitation. So it's kind of a touchy subject, I guess, and so it's kind of not been talked about, I don't think, enough here in Lakeview, especially. But we have quite a big stigma just by being a rural small town. So a rural small town throughout, especially in America, kind of have this stigma around them of being either unsafe or not well traveled, rural, small. Those type of things we kind of wrestle with through our tourism and visitation end of what we see with tourists and visitors coming through our town. So kind of I'll give some facts to you guys in a little bit, but keeping that in mind when I'm talking about the big numbers that I'm going to talk about on spending and different groups spending, keeping that idea that we're small, and so it does affect us actually a lot more than even a bigger city. So our economic growth is kind of rested upon our local spending and our traveler spending. So when we have travelers come through, visitors come through, if they don't feel like Lakeview is a safe place to stop or a welcoming area for them, they'll just keep driving through. And that hurts my heart because my job is to get our economic, get the money going into our businesses all year round as much as we can. So everything that we try so hard to do can be affected by our perception of our town and the welcoming aspects of our businesses. So LGBTQ community spends $100 billion a year in the US. So that's that big number that I was going to talk about. So huge, huge number. So they are actually the highest spending tourism group currently. So I did a little bit more research on that to actually find out and how we would be affected here rurally, because that's a big number, and obviously we're not going to get, $100 billion into Lakeview tomorrow because we decided that we had an inclusion talk and we're all good with it. So I know that's not going to happen. So I went in and kind of just really started researching what that looks like for us. So I called a family member that I have who is openly gay, and I spoke to her about her experiences through travel. And she told me a story that I'll just kind of share with you that really resonated with how I look at our travel expenses and how our visitors may look at how we are welcoming. So she was traveling. It was not Oregon, it was in Washington actually. She was traveling and she was driving all night. She was by herself and stopped at a hotel that had a very clear vacancy lit up. And she got out and went inside. The hotel had a couple of cars, and it was kind of owned by a mom and pop, husband and wife, older. And she said, can I rent a room? And they said, no, sir, you can't. And she said, oh, I'm not a sir, but, I just need to stay the night. He said, we're full. And she said, well, is there any other hotels that I can stay here in this town? And he said, no, they're all full. And so she got in her car and she left that town. So that town lost a night's stay, which then affects our hotel tax funds, which goes directly into tourism. They lost a meal the next morning at one of their restaurants, right? You could get up, you have breakfast before you hit the road. So that's 2 bits of income that town lost. It's the same way that's affected if someone, just any random person has a bad experience at any business in town and they decide, this town, no good, drives on. So the same way that I look at that experience, I look at this experience. So when we have those experiences in other small towns, it creates this perception that small towns, they're just not the place for us, maybe. So we don't want that perception, because $100 billion. So these are spenders. This is a group that spends money. So when you're not welcoming and you're not accepting and you're not inclusive and you're not really focusing on diversity, what you're really doing is taking money away from your business, right? I mean, just clearly it's affecting your business, your bottom line, putting dinner on your kids' table. So, and in our community, every customer counts, right? We don't have an open floodgate full of just people coming through at all times. We always joke about our Lakeview traffic jams when there's, one person who's talking to the neighbor and you're like, come on already, like I have to get to work, wrap it up. So these are important bits of information for us, because this really rests on how we'll thrive. But also, more importantly, if the town next to us really starts focusing on inclusiveness and diversity, and they're more welcoming, then they'll find that out and they'll drive there. So you're not being competitive as well. So you're letting the next town over get your hotel stay, get your breakfast, get your lunch, all of that. So you're just giving that to them. So inclusion is what the definition is, which I looked up because I wanted to make sure that I really understood it. The definition in the dictionary says including a great deal or encompassing everything, embracing everything. So treating everyone the same. So if you look at even more numbers, so Hispanics, so we have a large Hispanic population here in Lakeview. Hispanics have a $1.7 trillion purchasing power. So these aren't numbers that are small. These are big, big numbers. And when we aren't inviting and including diversity into our community, into our businesses, into our town, we're losing these numbers, and we're not thriving. So when I see those numbers, it really upsets me because we have such a big opportunity here. We really kind of tout ourselves as welcoming and Western hospitality and, you know, just being a wonderful community, which we are. But everyone needs to embrace this. This is something that's happening, and it almost feels to me, and it's such a kind of a bad word to say with it, I think, but it's almost trending. It's big. It's something that is coming because of a generation that's moving on. And so a new generation is coming up, which things change during those times, right? So the generation that thought differently of ethnic groups and women, LGBTQ, and accessibility groups are kind of moving on. And so now we have a whole new customer base. So we have a whole new generation that's coming up. And that generation is more collaborative, they're more team thinkers, they're more inclusive, and they're more focused on diversity. So we need to not only embrace diversity for our economic development, but also, I mean, just for our whole general community reputation. Things affect Lakeview racially, they affect Lakeview through social media. We have had racial instances that have gone viral very recently. That affects our tourism, our visitation, 100%. That affects people stopping in Lakeview and feeling welcomed and spending money here. There was a group that I spoke to that said if they see a sticker in a business that promotes diversity, they will stop their car, go in the business, and buy whatever they are selling. Whatever they are selling. Doesn't matter if they need it or not. If they see a church that has an acceptance sticker, they will stop and go, even if it's not even their faith. That's how important it is to them. And not only, you know, I'm standing here as, you know, heterosexual white woman, and so, you know, you can only say, you know, well, I know I have an aunt that's gay, or, you know, I have lots of friends that are, you know, of a different ethnic background. We don't know what different people go through, and listening to them and seeing what is needed and talking to them and including them in our community, which I don't think we've done a super great job of up to now. I think we have a wonderful community, and I think it's full of love, but I think we need to start talking and asking and conversing with the different types of population that we have here rurally to really find out what does make you feel welcome, and what does get you into my restaurant, and what does get you into my store. So asking those questions, being open and honest, and even with social media, even the bad stuff that's on there is still being talked about. So I don't think it's really all that bad. Another thing that I think we can really improve on, today actually, I watched a man in a wheelchair try and open 2 doors downtown. Neither one were accessible to him. And he did it, but watching that happen is not a fun thing to do. So you can't pick and choose who you're going to be inclusive to either. So you can't say, well, I wouldn't turn away someone in a wheelchair. My God, that would never happen. But then, you know, if an openly gay woman tries to come in, you turn them away. So you can't do that either. And you also can't put a sticker on your door that says, come on in, and then not let them rent a room. So it's a conversation that has a lot of deep layers. But each layer here rurally will affect us, or it'll affect our bottom line. It will make the difference if we're gonna thrive as a community and be welcoming to all. And all money looks the same to me. I mean, I don't know, I'm not afraid of money, I'm not sad. I'll take that $5 bill, that $5 bill, that $5 bill, I don't care. It all spends the same to me, and it all elevates our economic development. That's what we want. That's what we need. We don't have industry. We need tourism, because tourism can save Lakeview and push us into we can make our whole year with tourism. We have a ski hill. We have a rodeo. We have tons of geological features. We have biking options and trails and wonderful, tourism things that are super popular right now. I mean, we're sitting on really this untapped wonderland of visitation that we're just waiting to get. I mean, it really is something that we can absolutely profit on every day, any season. We're lucky here because we do have a ski hill. So our season doesn't have to be just summer. We get to have a winter season too. So I think learning and really finding things that we can use to help us and to include everyone in our community equally and treat equally. It's more than being kind to me. It's your bottom line. It's all of our bottom lines. It's our town, really. So it's pretty important. So does anyone have any questions or comments, or they want to yell or anything for me? No one wants to ask the first question.
You want comments now or after all the speakers?
Yeah, let's do it after.
Do you want to do after? Okay. So that's it for mine. I'm going to hand it off to Monique. So thank you for listening.
All right, my name is Monique Muro. I'm an assistant public defender in Anchorage, Alaska, and I'm coming down here to speak with you all today. I have a PowerPoint presentation with not too many slides, so I'll let my mom get that set up for me. But let me know if you can't hear me. I think it's easier to use my hands and flip through my paperwork than use the microphone. But while we are waiting for that to get set up, I will just piggyback off of what Jessica just had to say, because I think her topic of discrimination is, and as it pertains to economics, it's an interesting topic, but it's actually very well settled in the law. And the Supreme Court has already used economic justifications for discrimination to enforce federal regulations that prevent businesses from discriminating against people for race, sex, gender. And the Supreme Court said that that was appropriate because discriminating against people affected the national economy. And so the court said that when it came with it dealt with interstate commerce, and therefore the court had jurisdiction to regulate that, and so that is why businesses cannot discriminate against.
Could you use the mic? I think
Okay.
it would be better for the thing. Thank you.
Sorry, I tested this all earlier and it worked.
What if you want to go in where I stand there? Good.
I'm going to tell a quick story while we wait. The change is hard. My friend Valerie's grandfather was used to horses and buggies over in Bly. And when he started driving a car, he thought, well, this is interesting. Whenever he wanted it to brake, he would pull back and go, whoa, whoa. I think he ran into a fair number of things. Also, backing up was a trick, because horses don't back up. You go around in circles, excuse me. So rear, and then he'd wait until he heard broken glass, and then he knew he'd hit wherever it was, and he could go forward again. And I love that story because it shows that change is hard. We're getting there.
Okay, so I'm gonna be stepping back on more of a national level, and speaking to you all about discrimination in the justice system. And so this has nothing to do, I guess there's no local information about your community in this presentation, but feel free to stop me if you have any stories or feel like you want to share anything, any of your experiences that relate to any of these topics. But essentially today I want to speak to you all about 3 different topics in the criminal system that I think are important when it comes to discrimination, especially with race. But I wanted to speak to you about stop and frisks, pat down searches, Terry stops, it kind of all mean the same thing. But it's essentially the first interaction people tend to have with police officers when a criminal case is charged. And then the second topic I wanted to speak with you about was pretrial release and bail and how race discrimination plays into that and how people tend to can remain in custody for long periods of time and how that can impact the case and their lives. And then lastly, I wanted to speak with you all about race and discrimination in a trial case, and especially with wrongful convictions and some of the data we have on that and how race plays a factor. And there's discrimination in other aspects too. I'm an assistant public defender and have been doing that for 2 years now, but I was previously a prosecuting attorney. And I saw all of these things come up in my practice and still do, but I obviously represent people who don't have enough money to afford a private lawyer, so in the indigent community, and there's certainly discrimination, I think, for not only race, but people who are younger, so age discrimination, and then people who simply can't afford private counsel, so discrimination against the poor. But let's talk first about stop and frisk, and we can go on to the next slide. But when I talk about stop and frisk, I'm talking about pat-down searches. It is when a police officer stops a civilian and initiates what's called an investigatory stop. And in order to do this, this privilege, I guess, for the police arises from the Supreme Court case of Terry v. Ohio. And this is one of my favorite quotes from that Supreme Court case. But that case dealt with the question of whether police officers needed probable cause to initiate an investigatory stop and to pat someone down for the presence of weapons, or if they were allowed to have a lesser standard. And so the two arguments were, Mr. Terry, for example, argued that the police officer who stopped him should have had probable cause that a crime was being committed, a higher standard than what the state was arguing. The state argued that a lower cause was allowed reasonable suspicion. And the Supreme Court had to decide this issue essentially of whether to give police officers to increase their powers by allowing them to have a lower standard to stop people, question them, and to pat them down for weapons. And the court found in favor of the state's argument and said that, and perhaps rightfully so, that police officers have a very dangerous job and that they're put in these positions every day, dangerous positions where they have to make decisions on the fly. The circumstances are constantly changing, and the police officers need to know that when they are stopping someone, that person is not armed with a weapon. And so the Supreme Court found in favor of the police, and police are now able to conduct these pat-down searches, Terry stops with just reasonable suspicion. And reasonable suspicion means that, and the court defined this, that there has to be reasonable, articulable facts of a crime being committed, so that's the first prong, but also that a crime is being committed and that the officer believes the person to be armed with a weapon. So if those two steps are met, then the cop can ask them to step aside and pat them down for the presence of a dangerous weapon. And in the Terry case, the cop saw Mr. Terry walking back and forth down the street in front of a business, looking in through the windows. There was another person, a co-defendant, so he walked up and down the street, looked through the window of this business, and then confer with this other person. And this cop, as the facts came out during trial, the cop testified that based on his training and experience, he found this to be behavior of casing for a burglary and thought it was suspicious, and that's when he initiated his investigation, stopped Mr. Terry and asked to search him for weapons. And you can. So when I look at stop and frisks, unfortunately, I think there is a lot of data that shows that they have been abused by police officers. And the New York study is a really great study to look at that data. And that's because they were sued. And in 2013, the federal court found that the way stop and frisks were being implemented in New York was unconstitutional because it was discriminatory. But you can see from the data that in New York especially, there were a lot of stop and frisks. In 2011, it really peaked where there were over 500,000, 605,000, well, probably even more than that, but 2011, okay, so 685,724 people were stopped and frisked in New York. And of those people who were stopped, 88% were completely innocent. There was no evidence of a crime, there was no weapon on them, they were just stopped, searched, and let go. And it's troubling to see that because it's about 9 out of 10 people who were stopped by police had done nothing wrong. And especially when you're looking at the quantity of people that were stopped, it amounted to a lot of people in New York, and the data showed that at the end of this project, and I think it had been going on for over 10 years, that it really had created this resentment in minority communities against police. And that was one of the most detrimental things, the outcomes of this New York initiative, was because it created this hostility between police and the communities, and it, rather than allowing for joint efforts, it really just separated them and caused more problems in the end. It's also interesting though, New York crime was declining during the time of the stop and frisk, but when the stop and frisk policies in New York were found to be unconstitutional and seized, crime continued to decline, and the research later, Washington Post has some good research on this, found that there really was no correlation between the stop and frisk and the decline in crime. And we can go on to the next slide. So some of the outcomes of improper stop and frisks, and by improper I mean where police officers are stopping people, searching them without any basis, without these reasonable, articulable facts of a crime. And essentially fishing expeditions where police officers see someone, oftentimes minorities, and decide that they want to stop and search them. And it all is kind of just a domino effect, right? If they stop someone, find drugs or paraphernalia on them, well then there's an arrest, and there's probable cause for an arrest and a criminal case is charged. But my job as a public defender, and one of the things I always look at when I get a police report, is to look at the initial stop. Was there a reasonable basis for the cops to initiate that stop in the first place? What were their reasonable, articulable facts? And if that stop was improper, then I'm absolutely filing motions to get that case dismissed. Because if you don't have a proper stop, then everything the cops got after that improper stop is not allowed into evidence, and they essentially have no case. So that's the remedy from a defense perspective of these bad stops. But on a community level, it certainly affects the community and the way communities look at police officers. And Stan, can you go back to that slide? So some of the other outcomes though, and this is what a lot of the research has shown, that these are the outcomes of improper stop and frisk, is that minorities are more often searched by police officers. They are, and by searches I don't mean just the outer body pat down, they are, their vehicles are searched, items are removed from their pockets, their wallets are gone through. These are more excessive searches that would typically require probable cause. So minorities and these overzealous patent searches are more often searched. They are more often subject to canine sniffs. They're often subject to further investigatory measures like interrogation or brought into a police department to be interrogated by detectives, those kinds of things. And the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics has the data to support this, and the FBI Uniform Crime Reporting website as well is where I got that information from. But unfortunately for people involved in the justice system, it's also just a well-known fact. And the kind of joke about it in the public defender realm for people, especially attorneys getting like DUI cases where cops are stopping clients, and the joke is, oh, well, you got another driving while brown case. And those are the kind of cases where we look to see if the stops were proper, because we, at least in my office, we're pretty successful at getting those cases dismissed when there's improper police contact. And we can go on to the next. And so the next thing I wanted to talk to you about was pretrial release. So this is kind of the next phase in a criminal case. Once there's been a police contact and the police finds that there's probable cause to arrest somebody, then a case is created. They're usually charged with a crime, and the judge has to set bail, and they have 48 hours to set bail. So once someone's been charged with a crime, like I said, a judge or magistrate will set bail, and the purpose of bail is twofold. It's to ensure the safety of the community, and it is to ensure that this person appears at their future court date. So those are the two goals of bail that the judge needs to consider. It's what the two things they should be considering. And so the purpose of my presentation is to outline some of the data that shows that there are biases that go into that. And so here's some data on pretrial incarceration. And so again, these are people who have just been charged with a crime, but they've not been found guilty of a crime. They are still innocent, but they are on bail until the case resolves one way or another. And most of this data was I pulled from the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics. I use a lot of this too in my own bail arguments. If I'm filing a bail appeal, if I think a judge has ordered bail that is excessive, then I'll file a bail appeal and I'll include a lot of this, and it's usually successful to have the judge reconsider and lower the bail to what I ordered initially. African Americans were incarcerated in local jails at a rate of 3.5 times that of white people, basically. And that was from the 2016 statistics. 70% of pretrial release requires money bond, and this, of course, disproportionately affects people who can't afford that. So people like my clients who are homeless or indigent, or not even indigent, but I mean, many of the private attorneys in Anchorage require a $10,000 cash retainer before they even look at the case. And so, I mean, $10,000 is hard for a lot of people to post, even if you are homeless. So, and in Anchorage and in most communities, bail can be a mixture of different things. It can be a cash amount, so judges can order a defendant to pay a cash amount of money to ensure appearance and performance. But they can also order things like ankle monitor or house arrest, or order you to check in with a pretrial officer once a month. In Anchorage, we have something called a third-party custodian, where a judge can order someone to basically be babysat by someone 24/7. And so these are all different options for pretrial bail, but sometimes there are judges, and in my experience, who will set bail at even $50. And I've had clients where $50 would be enough to keep them in custody for 3 or 4 months, the extent of their criminal case. And that's obviously not, it absolutely disproportionately affects people who are poor. And the statistics also show that that tends to be people of color. And then the final point, Blacks and Latinos are more likely than whites to be denied bail, to have a higher money bond set, and to be detained because they cannot pay their bond. And it's similar to what I was talking about, but really, judges are supposed to be looking at just those two factors, the danger to the community and their appearance risk, but unfortunately, there is significant data to show that race, gender, socioeconomic factors all come into play too. And I guess before I get onto this, I'll talk a little bit about the dangers of those, of race and other discriminatory factors coming into play as far as bail and pretrial release. And it's dangerous, and I see it in my cases, because If I have a client who cannot post bail, and you can imagine in your own lives, if you're the breadwinner in your family, or if you, if you're the breadwinner in your family and you have kids and you're in custody for sometimes even 2 or 3 weeks, and that's one paycheck. And if your family relies on that paycheck and you're not working, you can absolutely see how that is a client I have who says, you know what, I'll take any deal. If it's a misdemeanor or a felony, or even if it's a felony, but if I don't have to do any jail time, I'll take it, because tomorrow my wife needs to be able to feed our children. And if I don't have that paycheck, then this is the only way I'm getting out of custody, then this is the deal I'm gonna take. And there's no amount of coaxing or convincing that me as their legal counsel can give them to change their mind, because at the end of the day, it's gonna take a few weeks, we're gonna get them out of jail. And in those kinds of instances, it's the pressure to accept a plea deal is high. Even in those cases where I haven't received any evidence, I don't know if there's a defense, I don't know how strong this case is, but when someone is held in custody and they feel like they don't have a way to get out except by pleading guilty, I see that a lot, and it's unfortunate. Another factor is I have a lot of clients who have mental illness or other medical disorders that they are not getting treated when they're in custody. It's difficult to have clients get their prescriptions and medical care while they're in jail. It's another pressure to get people to plead guilty or do whatever they can to get out of jail. And all of that can be remedied if they have access to bail, even if it's not a cash amount. I mean, I see a lot of communities, New Jersey in particular is one that is trying to stray away from a cash bail amount, and they've done a large project on this. But finding alternatives to ensure performance and appearance rather than requiring people to pay cash bail, because if you can remove that pressure from people to plead guilty right off the bat, I think it helps the justice system and helps ensure fairness, rather than having people feel like they need to just plead guilty. All right, so now the final piece of what I wanted to talk about was wrongful convictions. And so this is kind of the tail end of a criminal case. This is when someone has been gone to trial, they've not accepted a deal, they've gone to trial, and they've been found guilty. And you can go on to the next slide. I pulled a lot of this data from the National Registry of Exonerations, which is the largest, I guess, data set we have of wrongful convictions in the United States. It's a joint project between the University of Michigan and the University of California, Irvine, and they have looked at wrongful convictions in the United States. And you might have also heard about the Innocence Project, which is gaining a lot of traction in the US too, and they've done a lot of work on trying to get wrongfully convicted people exonerated. And this is I found this table to be useful. It shows the, people who were found to be not guilty, in fact innocent, after they were convicted, and breaks it down by offense type and also by race type. And you can see certain types of offenses, especially in the murder cases, where Black people were disproportionately found to be innocent at a much higher rate than those of other races. Murder and drug crimes as well. Those are two, and drug crimes especially are ones that I see in my practice very often, where Black people are more frequently stopped by police. In my practice, the ones who are subsequently more frequently searched by police, and you can see that data reflected in this also. And again, this is statistics about people who were ultimately found to be not guilty. Not guilty after having been convicted. So they were convicted, and then later, by perhaps retesting the evidence or looking more closely at the evidence, they were found to have been fact convicted. And here's some more data on kind of looking at those different offense types and how race and discrimination plays a factor in there. All right, so with murder cases, these are ones that get a lot of attention. I think Netflix has put on a few series too about exonerating murderers and that kind of thing. A lot of money and attention goes into these cases, other high-profile cases. But you can see that African Americans constituted 47% of the 1,900 people who were exonerated, as listed in the National Registry of Exonerations. Innocent Black people are about 7 times more likely to be convicted of murder than innocent white people. African Americans in prison for murder are more likely to be innocent if they were convicted of killing white victims. 31% of innocent African American murder exonerees were convicted of killing white people. And so not only do you have are African American or people of color more likely to be innocent of these crimes as opposed to innocent white people, but even before they're fully exonerated, they also tend to spend more time in prison before they're released. And and so it just goes to show that state prosecuting offices are putting more effort into keeping people of color in prison than they are keeping white people in prison, even if the evidence shows that they shouldn't have been there in the first place. We can go on to the next. And as far as sexual assault cases, African American prisoners serving time for sexual assault are 3.5 times more likely to be innocent than a white sexual assault convict. African American sexual assault exonerees receive longer prison sentences than white sexual assault exonerees, and they also spent an average of almost 4.5 years longer in prison before exonerated. So similar to the murder statistics. Keep going. And with the drug cases are interesting because they don't get as much attention as the murder cases or the sexual assault cases. Those are ugly, high-profile cases. They often make the news. There's usually media and courtrooms for those kinds of cases. But drug cases are oftentimes misdemeanors. They are, at least in Anchorage, unless there's like an issue of drug trafficking or dealing that might elevate it to a felony offense. It's oftentimes just a misdemeanor offense with a maximum of a year. And so these are the kind of cases that don't usually get a lot. These aren't the kind of cases where people are going back and reviewing the evidence or retesting the drugs 5 years later. But there is some new evidence and data to show that these are also the kind of cases where a lot of mistakes are being made. African Americans are about 5 times as likely to go to prison for drug possession as whites. Innocent Black people are about 12 times more likely to be convicted of drug crimes than innocent white people. And I got those statistics from the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics as well. But I also found on their website, it was interesting that they pointed out that these facts are true even despite the fact that the statistics also show that African Americans and whites tend to use illegal substances at about the same rate. So one study, so again, the drug crimes, because they're low level usually and people aren't spending very much time in custody for drug offenses unless they have many prior drug offenses that might make it a felony or unless it's a large quantity, they're just not getting very much attention. But I found this study to be very interesting that in Harris County, Texas, they were going back, in fact, and testing the drugs that resulted in convictions. And they found that when they went back and tested the controlled substances, or what they thought to be controlled substances, they found that 133 of the people in drug possession cases were, in fact, not carrying illegal drugs, that they were not controlled substances. 62 of those exonerees were Black, and this is in a county where only 20% of the population was Black. And in, since 1989, the 1,800 defendants were cleared in group exonerations, where there were 15 large-scale police scandals that showed police misconduct for framing innocent defendants. The majority of those were African American, and that I also got from the National Registry of Exonerated, whatever it was. But it's interesting to me because I do have, these are also, like I said, oftentimes misdemeanors, so these many times are the kinds of cases where I have clients who are in jail, and again, you can put yourself in their position where they're in custody and they can't post $1,000 bail or $2,000 bail, and the offer is, well, just plead guilty. Plead guilty to possessing marijuana, it'll be 3 days time served, you'll get out tomorrow, and so they'll do it. And it's, at least from my perspective, it's a good reminder for me to scrutinize the reports that I receive and scrutinize the kind of evidence that is holding my clients in custody before they plead guilty. That was all I had prepared for today, but I did want to end with a quote that I like from Justice Thurgood Marshall. And if I had more time, I would have talked a bit about the kind of other phases of the trial or criminal case that I think are important, but they kind of all fall along the same lines, especially as it deals with sentencing after someone has been convicted of a crime and someone's eligibility for parole. But you all, again, this is all mostly national information and national statistics, so you guys are in a position to know how this affects your own community and if it is at all in play here. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jane. I knit crochet everywhere I go. I want to just tell a few little stories to bring it back to Lake County and to share some of my experience. We really didn't have a huge agenda other than we were willing to talk about this, the topic of diversity, inclusion, and specifically anti-Black racism in Lake County. And it was spurred by a conversation that happened on Lakeview Announcements about an incident at the high school. And that's how I met this dear smart woman who said, we should have a conversation and maybe do a little public thing. And I'm sure I'm an extrovert. So here I am. And with these smart people with me. I wanted to just point out some stories since I've moved here from the East Coast, from an urban area. And just then we can open up for discussion, see what other people want to talk about. You may remember the movie, and then before that, the book, Roots. And Alex Haley has a quote that I thought was very helpful. If you think about it, there's not a religious group or nation, there's not a tribe or any grouping of people, to my knowledge, who have not at one or another time been this object of hatred, racism, or who has not had people against them, just because they were them. And I think one of the quotations, another quotation that I couldn't find, but I remember mostly, that helps me is by a feminist named Robin Morgan, who said, find the place where you feel oppressed or other or looked down on, and then whatever that part of you experiences that, know and build a bridge to other people in their oppressions, even if they are different. And in her case, it was being female and Jewish. I think in Lake County, I am reminded of a young man I met who was a Paisley high schooler at the time and is now in college. He grew up in Paisley and various places in Klamath Falls and went to some sort of intensive academic summer camp near Portland. And he experienced a look of disgust, dismissal, when he told them where he was from. He's from Eastern Oregon, and everybody just assumed, well, if you're from Eastern Oregon, you're stupid. And in telling me that story, he almost teared up. I mean, he was like, I don't cry, I'm a boy. But in fact, he felt that crushing feeling of, wait, you don't know me. You don't know how smart my rancher family is. We are all college educated. I mean, he immediately is feeling like, well, why are you looking down on me because I'm a white male? Why shouldn't I have all the privileges that attest to that? And that is an example of his feeling, okay, well, I'm from a rural area. I'm from a ranching family. And people in certain places are going to look down on me for that. Most people in big cities, East Coast, have never heard of Lakeview or Lake County. They may have heard of Klamath Falls, maybe they've heard of Crater Lake. But in any case, he carries with him a sense now that he is at a disadvantage in certain settings. I mean, for 1 minute or for a day at a summer camp, he felt misunderstood and discounted. And imagine what it's like to be an effeminate male, or any number of other groups or kinds of people who are in the extreme minority. That's a Lake County story, and I hope for this young man that he will, knowing what that's like to experience, will build a bridge to other people who, for whatever other reasons, might feel discounted, looked down upon, etc. I used the story of the gentleman who started driving cars and would go whoa on the steering wheel whenever he wanted it to stop. It clearly wasn't a horse, but all he knew was whoa. And I just wanted to share a few things that I keep stumbling upon. The example is that change is hard. One is I'm in mental health. I'm clearly mental, so that fits. But I'm also 33 years as a licensed clinical social worker, and I do mental health counseling and lots of other things over at the clinic. And I am still trying to get out of the habit of saying committed suicide. People in the suicide prevention world want us to stop saying committed. The word is completed. Because committed immediately sounds like it's a crime. And it is a sin in certain religious theologies, but it's not a crime. And sometimes it's much like stage 4 cancer. It's the end result of a sometimes fatal illness, which is depression. So I'm going, completed suicide, or attempted suicide, but not committed suicide. I mean, that is so hard for me to do, because it just rolls off the tongue. Even suicide prevention people stumble over it, because it's part of, those two words go together. Committed suicide. So just to say, another is wheelchair bound. That is politically incorrect in the disability rights world, because they're not bound. In fact, people who use wheelchairs are liberated by them, unless they find a curb that hasn't been cut out or doors that open. And in fact, today, we have this whole wheelchair dance getting into the Lake Health Clinic, because some of the doors you can push and it goes beep, and others you're like, can you just hold on 1 second and open the door, you put your foot out, and then can you scoot your legs just a little bit? I mean, it's ridiculous. And another reason to bring up wheelchair users, people who benefit from the use of a wheelchair, is that when people say, oh, I don't want to have to change my language because it's grammatically incorrect or it's awkward or whatever, I say, well, there are not very many people, percentage-wise, who use wheelchairs. In our town, I know of maybe 3 or 4 people that I personally know. There are probably more than that. But the fact that the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, and that certain consequences for civic spaces, especially curbs, but also to some degree public buildings, they need to be accessible for people who use wheelchairs. How inconvenient is that? I mean, those doors, when you push it, also, if you want to open it yourself, it's really hard. So something about the mechanism of an automatic door makes it work 10 times as heavy. So we who do not use wheelchairs are inconvenienced. But I don't think any of us in Lake County would argue, well, maybe 1 or 2, and we won't talk about them, but would argue that it's a waste of money to make things more accessible for people in wheelchairs. I mean, if we're lucky, we'll live long enough to need one and benefit from one, right? So I'm drawing that question about wheelchair users to talk about gender expression. Now, this is really outrageous here in Lake County, I know. But I have a collection of buttons that tell the story of which pronouns we use. And this is for transgender people. Trans people are very small in number, and I need to look up what the number is. but perhaps comparable to wheelchair users, really a very small, they're the T in LGBTQ. But a person may look feminine, have earrings on, purple hair, and say, my pronouns are he, him, and his. And what we as regular American folks need to do is say, okay, nice to meet you, Aaron. Is it spelled E-R-I-N or A-A-R-O-N? Just let me know. I don't call you Aaron. Or, more awkward yet, is they, them, their. My sister's middle kid is gender nonconforming. You look at Yuki, used to be named Makoto, half Japanese, if you couldn't tell. Yuki looks like a gay boy. He just does. But see, I misgendered him without even thinking. They actually have cute little boobs because they have been taking estrogen. I'm going to share this with you, Yuki, so you know that you're famous in Lake County now. And this would be the button that they would wear. I bring this up, and I know there's a lot of debate and concern about, what is our world coming to when we have boys that look like girls and girls that look like boys, and what the heck is that? Is that a he or a she? And the story you told, she is heterosexual about not getting a room in the hotel. Oh, she is gay. Presenting as a man. When people misgender, they never misgender me because I'm crocheting, and that's a gender-specific female activity. But I'm going to teach this reporter right here that crochet is the last thing I do because there's some amazing male crocheters. But anyway, but when people I know get misgendered, we call her his or her. Yes, sir. A little eye roll, and who cares? Other people, they're really offended. And I want to share with you another idea, and it's called the platinum rule. Instead of the golden rule, which is to treat people as you would want to be treated, actually, the better way to do it, and it's harder, is to treat people as they want to be treated. That's really hard, because you kind of have to know how they want to be treated. But I grew up and practiced social work and everything else about my life in Washington, D.C. And I learned that you never hold your hand out to shake the hand to a Hasidic male because they will not touch a female who is not blood kin. So no point in saying, how you doing? Love your curls. Love the fedora. You're adorable. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be very respectful, and I'm going to say, nice to meet you, sir. Because they're very gender clear, what they wear and everything else, not any ambiguity there. So I just want to share some of these ideas because I think, oh my word, they, them. I mean, I know perfectly progressive liberal people with LGBT members of their family who still go, oh, and I say, but it's awkward to wait for that stupid door, and it's awkward to help your loved one in a wheelchair over a curb that doesn't have a cutout. Life is awkward, change is hard. We do the best we can. We try to figure ourselves. Another thing I wanted to mention is that, we're two white gals and a person of color. And that's a little awkward too, right? She's like, which color am I? I'm purple today. I just feel purple. The whole cultural way we dance around culture and race is a growing edge for we humans who are tribal, who would just as soon stick with our own because it's comfortable, it's what we know. I feel as though humans are always between the tension of tribal, comfortable, familiar, you're my people, and what the Bible asks us to do is welcome the stranger. That's hard. It's hard to welcome the stranger. I might say, hi, how you doing? And actually, we once picked up a hitchhiker, that's how old I am. It was a boy and a girl filled van going to a protest, And this gal was clearly going there too, and she would not say one word to the males in the van, and I'm like, oh, okay, I guess I better, how you doing? Oh, fine, I'm fine. She was a separatist. I have yet to meet another separatist as staunch as she was, except for Mary Daly. Anybody know who Mary Daly is? She wrote all kinds of books, and she was such a separatist feminist that she would not, when she came to my college, this is 1980, that's how old I am, she would not recognize males with questions. They were invisible to her. And she was making a point. So many boys get answered and girls don't say anything, they don't even raise their hands or they don't get called on. So many boys have so many privileges to do so many things that girls don't have to do. She was making up for Rudolph's time. Now, boy, were those privileged boys who were going to Overland College in Ohio miffed. We were like, welcome to our world, honey. Just making these points because every one of us in different settings feel awkward, feel like, oh dear, what's the lingo, what do we do? But I think the platinum rule is a good thing to attempt. I also think we were talking about, we're a couple of white chicks, aren't we? Okay, the white chicks over here. That what's happening in the United States of America is the re-browning of America. It's not the browning of America, it's the re-browning of America. It was brown, it got white. And we're not gonna talk about Indian genocide tonight, okay? I'm not even gonna mention the words Indian genocide. Watch how I didn't say the words Indian genocide. Okay, I've made my point. And what's happening now is a re-browning. In 2060, I hope to be really good and dead. I would be 100 something. But my grandkids or your grandkids will be alive, and the country, one projection is that there'll be maybe 35% white folks, and what we call white is completely arbitrary. Italians were not thought of as white until they got here and stood here a while. Those folks. And then roughly a third, 33%, language in Hispanic, speaking Spanish. And then about 17% African American. But you know, one of the things that this smart young woman didn't share is how small the Black population is. Even in New York City, you know, it's maximum 22%, depending on what borough you're talking about. And yet, we were seeing at the high rates they were being arrested. In any case, once the white folks are less than 50% of the entire nation's population, we will be predominantly brown. And what I have always experienced is that until I moved out here, I grew up in what was called Chocolate City. District of Columbia has been majority Black for decades and decades. And it's also very international because it's the capital city of the most important country on the planet. You can wager whether we're more powerful or richer, well, we are richer, but we're losing other kinds of status, but we still wield the most power on the planet. And that city of 700,000 people is very multicultural, and that was normal for me. What I've learned as I've gotten older, and as I studied racism, is that the Black-white dynamic in the United States of America is a terrible wound on our national psyche, even when there are no Black people around. And I particularly find moving the quote from Abraham Lincoln, which is from the second inaugural address, and he talks about roughly, do we have to pay for every lash of the whip by every drawing of swords? And he just equated them, that slavery was a sin, and and how much, Lord, I mean, it's in the form of a prayer, how much suffering will we as a nation have to have because of the sin of slavery? And we don't have time for me to go into why I think the sin of slavery punishes us
every day, whether or not we ever set sight on a Black person, and God bless you, sir. As the minority of all minorities here in Lake County, I think it's important to recognize that Black oppression shapes public policy, shapes attitudes, shapes how we feel about so many topics, especially public assistance and social security and social services. But I grew up in a town where all of my children's physicians were Black. I had a son with a tricky diagnosis, and he went to an African American ENT, and he went to an African American neurologist. And the head of George Washington University Medical Center, his name's Skip. Clearly he went to a white private school, but he was a cute Black man. Kind of like Barack Obama. Very, 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 very well educated, but still Black. You know how our wonderful golfer Tiger Woods says, I'm not Black, I'm Cablinasian, meaning Caucasian, Black, and Asian, until he tries to hail a cab. And then he's just as Black as every other Black kid because he can't get one. So someday, I don't know what the context would be, but to talk about the Black-white dynamic in America is complicated. But I want to read a couple of quotes and make a couple more points, and then we'll open it up to discussion. One of the things that I think is interesting about the dynamic of this country is that there was a time when the South was full of Democrats. And then the Republicans actually, this is as political as I'm gonna get, had something called the Southern Strategy, where they were going to appeal to the white Democrats in the South and implicitly, very subtly, appeal to their racism. And therefore turn the South mostly Republican. And this is part of that dynamic. This is one of Richard Nixon's advisors. I'm ashamed to say he's a Christian Scientist, which was what I grew up to be, but anyway, never mind. Tangent. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we could make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing them. And I know we had absolutely good reason to see that Black man mugshot, but it also made me cringe, because there's something culturally in every TV show, or virtually the majority of the way African Americans are depicted as criminal, that is absolutely a distortion. In any case, part of the Republican strategy in 1968 was to criminalize hippies and Blacks and paint them as drug users. And enormous amounts of drug policy has come out of that. Although white kids who snort coke never go to jail as long as Black kids who smoke crack do. But anyway, third quote, we could arrest their leaders, including the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers were actually a social services group that, even though they carried around guns, which scared white people into next week, they were actually providing food and lunch programs and health care in cities, including at my church, at St. Stephen and the Insurrection. No, actually, St. Stephen and the Incarnation, but it was so leftist that they called us the Insurrection, was one of the places where they fed people in our neighborhood. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Just share that to say it helps evil to split us apart as humans. We are humans. We all bleed the same red, but we serve people who would take away our rights, people who would keep us poor, when we fight amongst ourselves. Our future, our fate, our economic well-being is in connecting with each other, even though it's hard, even though we grab the steering wheel and say, whoa, and even though I misgender my cute little sister's child, because there's no gender-free word for niece or nephew. My sister's child who is non-binary, and I misgender them instead of saying they. I'm hoping they take enough estrogen that I can just go she and be done with it. It's all uncomfortable, it's hard work. Lake County is just another place where we're majority white and we're going to have to get used to it changing. But I think we will. I think we are a welcoming community. I think we're afraid when we aren't. I think the sign that says, I have the right to serve, not to serve anyone, should disappear. And then it should be replaced with some cute little Lake County map that says, Lake County welcomes everyone. And I hope one of those letters is rainbow. But no, whatever. So that's what I have to say. And I'm so glad that you all were willing to listen to all of us. And free for all, right?
I want to thank y'all. I appreciate, I felt like a perspective of what we're dealing with this week, approach diversity and different looking neighbors than maybe we're used to. But I'm really concerned about is I have 3 kids in the school system, formerly worked in the school system. I think we're wonderful, we're great. But I heard the N-word 3 times this week in my own house or outside my door because kids are using it. And I showed up today because the N-word did show up in a paper that in my evaluation got a little authority when it was graded, and that was made okay. So I'm dealing with the kids in my house and the 4 outside my house all the time and how they come and go. I want to know that it's being dealt with in the school, and I don't feel like this community education inclusion about transgender, people of color, economic differences is going to really bring kids around to act in the way we need them to act. Because this only leads to separation and violence, and it scares me to death. If there's been one thing I thought I did right with my kids, is not to use that language. And not to even think that was possible, and to know, after 4 years here, that they'll use the F word, that they'll use the N word, that they didn't know what the S word was. They didn't know that Hispanic people were called that. I had to tell them that's a word we don't use. And I love this community, I'm committed to it. Buying my house around the corner. You gotta live somewhere. But I want to make the place I live better. I want it to rise to the occasion and to the time. And I want to know that we're all putting in that effort. And I appreciate your attendance here. You know how hard y'all work. This is way too hard to sit here on a seminar of diversity for y'all. As much respect as I have for you. You guys know this stuff. What are we going to do about these kids? And these are good kids I'm talking about. These are good ones with those words in their mouth. And I can't do it by myself, and I need to know that we're all doing it, that there's intolerance, zero tolerance for it. That we don't listen to it, we don't allow it. It doesn't happen, it's not spoken. And I want to know that that commitment is met by the rest of this community, because I believe it is. Knowing people individually, I believe it's there. I want to hear it out loud. I want to hear an absolute zero tolerance for all.
Let me just add real quick that one of our guests in the audience tonight is with the Oregon Department of Education, the Office of Civil Rights, who was here in Lakeview training the school district employees. So I think this is part of the progress. This is how we move forward. This is how we come together as a community. And if these steps are important, every step is important. So I just wanted to make sure you're aware of that.
To follow up, I wanted to follow up on what you said. But what I wanted to do was read something that I found in this book here, called Poetry of the Negro. Okay. And there's a word in here that some of you may not like, so may feel bad about, or whatever. But we're talking about kids here. A lot of us here aren't going to change. And this because we're older, we're adults. I don't see any kids in here. There's young fellows, a younger fellow, but I would call them a kid. So I'd like you to read this I'd like to read this poem to you by this individual, it's a man, and I can't read it because I don't have my glasses on. Excuse me. So we're talking about the kids. Because we're making an influence on the kids, what we do and what we do at home and on the streets and Facebook games and wherever. And then the title of the poem is Incident. And it was written by Kobe Collins in 1925. The individual was born in 1903. Very smart individual, went to New York City schools, graduated from New York University, got a master's at Harvard. Okay, here we go. It says, once riding in old Baltimore, heart filled, head filled with glee, I saw a Baltimorean, kept looking straight at me. Now I was 8 and very small, and he was no whit bigger. And so I smiled when he poked out his tongue and called me nigger. I saw the whole of Baltimore from May till December. Of all the things that happened there, that's all that I remember.
I think that ties exactly with what Jessica was saying. Those type of situations, statements, inappropriate words leave an impact on the entire community. The entire community gets labeled as
Thank you.
such.
I probably don't need this because I have a loud voice. I grew up in this town, was born and raised in this town. My picture's not up there because I'm so old that I graduated from the school across next door, which I think was a much better building. So you know how old I am. And I want to talk about Lake County and Lakeview because growing up here, there weren't any Black people. Not one. Well, there was, I take it back. There was an old man when I was very small whose mother has become a famous pioneer who was a housekeeper for Dr. Daly. And he was an old man at that time and sat around the old courthouse, the great old courthouse all the time. That was the only Black person I ever saw, and I was probably about 2 or 3 years old. But I grew up here, and in the 6th grade, I want to shout out to teachers. In the 6th grade, our teacher read a story to us. And it was a story about a Black man who lived in this country, who was on a trip. He was in the South, and he couldn't go into a motel that I could go into or a hotel. He couldn't eat where I could eat. And I thought, as a kid, I'd never heard of that before. Never heard of that before. And that was the 6th grade. And our teacher read that story. And that planted a seed in me about how could that be? How could that possibly be? We could treat people like that. So when segregation in the South started, fights against it started exploding, and Little Rock was the first that I remember when I was in high school. I was going to go down there. I was going to go to Little Rock, and I was going to convince those white people that they were wrong and they were evil, they needed to change, because they wouldn't let little kids into school because of the color of their skin. That was wrong. But I lived here when Klamath Indians got their money from, horrible story, from their reservation being taken away. And we all had awful stories about how they misspent the money. They all got $165,000. And oh gosh, they were wandering around in they were drunk and they were this and they were that. I never thought anything about that. I thought, oh yeah, okay. Never thought anything about that until I became a lawyer and went to Montana and worked with Indian people and saw the hurt and the pain that was caused by them. But I was still going to go to Little Rock. So I went to the University of Oregon. The reason I'm wearing this is not to tick off any of you beavers, but to tell you that from my 6th grade teacher here in Lake County, I took that seed that she planted in my head and I went to the University of Oregon and I joined up eventually with a group called the Congress of Racial Equality that were in Eugene, Oregon, where there were not very many Black people either. Oregon, as you know, has a horrible history of segregation, of whites only. But anyway, I got involved in that group. And I ended up, my parents, my little sister here came up for my graduation from college at the University of Oregon. And little beknownst to them, I had planned to go to Mississippi. I was one of the civil rights workers in 1964 in Mississippi, but I didn't tell my parents that I was going because they were from Lakeview, and that was a shameful thing for them. So when I told my parents that I was going to Mississippi, my mother it was horrible. She had a fit. She screamed and yelled that she wouldn't tell anybody where I was. She would tell them I was out traveling around the country after I graduated. Why she felt that was shameful? Because she comes from, like Jane said, that people in Lake County and everywhere who are racist. And she never thought of herself as racist, but she was. And so I went to Mississippi and stayed there for about a year, and saw what true hate is. True hate. And came back, I went to jail, and I ended up in the front page of the Oregonian. So that blew my mother's story about I was traveling around the country. I was and lo and behold, she had a woman in town, and you all know this is a class place. Lakeview is class conscious, very class conscious, and she had a woman who was in her class that she was afraid would say bad things about me because I went to work with Black people in Mississippi who called up and said, oh, I think Sandy's great. That's just a wonderful thing she did. My mother's kind of dropped her voice and her jaw. And so then I came back here to Lakeview and I taught in this school. I'm sorry, this ugly school. I'm sorry. Need to be back over there. But my first period, I taught social studies, and I took over from a teacher who had mono when he had to quit school. So I took over, and I had a teaching degree. And the first thing I get up and I face my class, and the son of the woman who called my mother, who said it was so great for me, she thought it was so great. And I knew him since he was this big. From the back of the room shouts, nigger lover. He didn't know any Black people. He didn't. Where did that come from? He was sitting in a white class in a white school and shouts out that phrase. So my point is that it wasn't, and when my parents blamed the University of Oregon for me turning into a radical. No, it wasn't the University of Oregon. It was my 6th grade teacher in Lakeview, Oregon that did that. So all you teachers, please, I know there's a rough time and a rough patch in school right now. Nobody's talked about Indians. I went to law school, I went to jail in Mississippi, I went to law school to keep myself out of jail. But I've worked with the Black community, I've worked in the Indian community. here, Indian prejudice is so strong that I know Indian kids who've gone through this school system who've never been treated right, never been treated. That Indian prejudice may be even stronger than Black prejudice. And why? So I think that we need to really understand. I've talked to Indian people who won't, in regard to Jessica's point, won't come to Lakeview. They don't feel it's welcoming. They may stop here and eat, but they get the hell out of here. And so, what if we had our 100th anniversary of the rodeo? When the rodeo first started, we had Indian people. We had hundreds and hundreds of Indian people coming to the rodeo and camping out. Do we have any Indian camping out this 100th anniversary? No. So that's another thing I think we have to think of, the prejudice about Indians are all drunks and Indians don't know how to handle money and Indians do this. So we've got a lot of work to do in this community, and I think it's painful, like Jane said, to talk about it. But that's what makes me so radical, and all of you who think I have a big mouth and I'm radical, the reason is Lakeview, because a seed was planted in my head by a teacher in Lakeview. So teachers, do your jobs. Confront it when you see it. And don't hide it, and don't push it away, and don't reward people for being so brilliant that they say the N-word in an essay. So I just think that we need to really look at ourselves and find out who we really are, who we put in jail here, who we stop here for Christ, what kids we keep in jail for so long, what color are they? So anyway, I could go on, and you're all tired of me, but I've got a big mouth, and I want to have you confront.
So we just have about 5 more minutes, so we'll do maybe 2 more comments, and then I appreciate everybody staying and listening.
My name is Judy Williams, and I'm a case manager here at my county. I didn't know what to expect tonight when I came, but what drew me were the words inclusion and diversity. So then I read on Facebook, some people wanted to talk about what happened at the school, and some people wanted to talk about choices. So I'm just here tonight to say that I hope we do more of this, because diversity and inclusion, and I'm 70. I started in mental health hospitals in the early 60s. I lived in Tennessee till the middle of 64. I walked in the civil rights stuff. I lived next door. We had segregation in the county I'm from. Buford Pusser. Anybody see Walking Tall many years ago? That was my county, McNairy County, by Selmer, Tennessee. So I've seen a lot of things. I've got a lot of life experience. I'll give you 2 little things that have happened to me socially and legally, because I work heavily with the ADA also. So I've heard a lot of comments, I read a lot of things on Facebook, and I thought, don't fight the law, because the law always wins, and it's coming to Lakeview. We're gonna get our sidewalks fixed one of these days. About 15 years ago, we had the commissioners go up and down the streets in wheelchairs, and they couldn't make it, but anyway, they have some time to fix some things, so. But all the comments from the school, and everybody has very, very strong opinions about what happened. I read all those really carefully, and I came out not agreeing with anybody, but I zipped it. I just thought, well, I'm gonna listen to everybody about how they feel about it. But in my job, it's getting to know individuals, not groups of people. Like tonight, we're talking about different groups, different tribes, different races, where you came from, what your family thought, and all of that. And yet, I'm just gonna challenge everybody tonight, people you run across instead of a group of blacks, Indians, whites, I'm Irish, all those things, is meeting people and hearing their stories is gonna be the most important thing. And sometimes the words, like the word sick, I'm sick of that. or baby that's sick, you know, they need two different things. So people that use the words that we're so offended by mean something totally different to different people. So we have to hear where they're coming from. So the one thing I wanted to share tonight was how it's like the group of people that I work with and the individuals, when it happened about 15 years ago when the state came in and said the rights of anybody over 18 years old in group homes, foster care, whatever, if somebody else was in charge of that house, they had the right to live however they wanted to in that home, to have whoever they wanted to visit, whether it was for dinner, overnight. You know, you want to talk about some upset people. People like to say what's going to happen in the house that they use to provide services to somebody. But people got to come in and spend the night, and the staff that I was manager over had to train them how to appropriately use sexual comments, what they really believed in. So it's been a growing process. You know, and it continues to be a growing process. But I'm happy this has started, and I hope you guys continue it, so people can just start talking about it.
Great, I saw one more comment over here and then we'll wrap it up for the evening.
I'd like to make a comment, if I could. I know, but I'm gonna make a comment. Let me make a
She
comment.
hasn't had a turn.
No.
Okay, look, I came here at 6 o'clock, meeting was at 5:30 to whatever. Okay, I think, I would ask you to at least give the group another half hour, because we've only heard from 2 or 3 people. There's some other things that I think we need to bring up. And this is what happens in this community. Is we say, oh, well, okay, we heard from 2 people, it's time to go home. No, let's talk about it. I'd like to hear what this young man has to say. I'd like to hear what maybe this individual over here.
Okay, well, why don't we let,
Okay.
everyone have a turn? And this will, well, we're not gonna hijack everybody for the night, but we will have more opportunities for these discussions.
That's what I would
and we
do.
will-
Okay, what I'd like to say is I've been waiting for over 3 years to see Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. And I think it would make a difference in our society. I just honor that woman. And Monique, I bet you know that our drug laws have always been racist. Starting with our first drug laws in America against the Chinese, about movement. And then the jazz clubs, and the Zoot Suit Rebellion, and marijuana. And then the black community got passed for heroin. It's all so bogus. I'm glad you have all those statistics. It's shameful. Thank you. Okay.
All right, I absolutely, we will have more of these discussions. These are hard discussions, and I really, really appreciate that everybody came and heard everybody out. My goal in these discussions is really to plant seeds, to come together as a community. You know, this is growing our community, that's the focus. And we will absolutely welcome points of view and you know, we don't, that's all I'm gonna say. Okay, well, thank you all, and I guess we can go to the next.